Biofuels, are they a viable option? By Jacob Tana. Renewable energy goals. With rising demand for energy, what can we as a people use rather than fossil fuels? What is being done about it? At the recent COP21 meetings in Paris, one of the main goals was to keep global temperature from rising another 2% degrees Celsius. Some goals the US has set out are help advance energy technologies and work towards a greener future. And lastly, some Minnesota goals. We want to have 25% of electricity come from renewable energy sources by 2025. Which renewable energy source is the best? Biofuels have gained a lot of political support and publicity as a viable alternative energy source, but can they really replace fossil fuels? What are the environmental effects? How much would be needed? Other problems, if any? And how much ethanol could Minnesota produce? The first article I read, Energy Sprawl or Energy Efficiency, Climate Policy Impacts on Natural Habitat for the United States of America, focuses on the problems of producing renewable energy resources and the energy sprawl that occurs. The production of many renewable energy sources causes damage to biodiversity and the release of greenhouse gases. Energy crop production is a particularly complex situation because even if new energy crop production occurs on land that was previously in agricultural production, remaining global demand for agricultural commodities may spur indirect effects on land use elsewhere, potentially causing an agricultural expansion in areas far from the location of the energy crop production. In reference to biofuels, they say, regardless of climate change policy, by 2030 we will need an area that is larger than the state of Nebraska. Lastly, given the high land use intensity of biofuels, techniques for either increasing the efficiency of biofuel production or making sites of energy crop production more biodiversity friendly should be a high priority for research. The second article I read, Land Clearing and the Biofuel Carbon Debt, focused on the carbon debt caused by growing biofuels. After clearing an environment of its native plants to grow biofuels, there can be an enormous store of CO2 released from the now deceased biomass. This graph shows the carbon debts caused by cutting down various ecosystems. Until the carbon debt is repaid, biofuels from converted lands have greater GHG impacts than those of the fossil fuels they displace. Our results show that converting native ecosystems to biofuel production results in larger carbon debts. At least for current or developing biofuel technologies, any strategy to reduce GHG emissions that causes land conversion from native ecosystems to cropland is likely to be counterproductive. Still, there may be some ways to grow biofuels without leaving a large carbon debt. Degraded and abandoned agricultural lands could be used to grow native perennials for biofuel production, which could spare the destruction of native ecosystems and reduce GHG emissions. Biofuels and Biodiversity is the next article that I read. It focuses on the battle between biofuels, biodiversity, and food production. They say, in short, the rapid development of biofuel markets could accelerate and magnify the rate and extent of landscape change, potentially exacerbating the degradation and loss of habitat to support biodiversity. Also, the fact that in the United States biofuel production has also gained substantial political support makes it difficult to put a stopper on the habitat degradation. And this box and arrow diagram shows the main causes and factors that go into biofuels. The conversion of natural ecosystem to agriculture is driven by an increasing demand for agricultural products, limits on the production capacity of existing agricultural land, and loss of existing farmland to degradation and urban and exurban expansion. Decisions about land use at local scales are affected by global factors such as the human population, increasing wealth in developing countries, increasing demand for grain, and greater emphasis on biofuels as an alternative to petroleum for fuel. Despite this negative outlook, they give a suggestion for accommodating form of biofuel production. Low input, high diversity mixtures of native grassland perennials can also provide more net energy, greater greenhouse gas reductions, and less agrochemical pollution than can corn or soybean feedstocks. Animals would also prefer LIHD lands because of their heterogeneous nature. Biofuels are usually planted in monocultures. The authors also mention some ways in which land use can and has been slowed. This suggests that for yield increases to lead to reduced land conversion, caps or other mechanisms to limit the amount of biofuel produced from dedicated biofuel crops could be required. Also, The CRP is an incentive program in which landowners enroll for a 10 to 15-year contract period during which they receive annual payments for lands taken out of agricultural production. Still, the CRP has been losing leverage in recent years in the face of high demand. They end by saying, biofuels have too much public, political, and economic momentum to be sidetracked or stopped by concerns about biodiversity. Still, there are ways in which biofuels can be developed that can enhance the coexistence of biofuels with at least some elements of biodiversity. The next article, Environmental, Economic, and Energetic Costs and Benefits of Biodiesel and Ethanol Biofuels, focuses on whether or not biofuels, specifically corn ethanol and soybean biodiesel, are really viable options. They lay down a few criteria for being a successful alternative. To be a viable substitute for a fossil fuel, an alternative fuel should not only have superior environmental benefits over the fossil fuel it displaces, be economically competitive with it, and be producible in sufficient quantities to make a meaningful impact on energy demands, but it should also provide a net energy gain over the energy sources used to produce it. And both of these do just that. Analysis has shown that both corn, grain, ethanol, and soybean biodiesel production result in positive NEBs. Unfortunately, as seen in the other articles, both of these have negative environmental effects. Both corn and soybean production have negative environmental impacts through movement of agrochemicals, especially nitrogen, phosphorus, and pesticides from farms to other habitats and aquifers. Agricultural N and P are transported by leaching and surface flow to surface ground and coastal water, causing eutrophication, loss of biodiversity, and elevated nitrate and nitrate in drinking water cells. A major obstacle of corn and soybeans as biofuels is that reaching these maximal rates of biofuel supply from corn and soybeans is unlikely because these crops are major contributors to human food supplies through livestock feed and direct consumption. Still, soybeans, they find, are the best food-based biofuels out there at the moment. Despite this, they still suggest that biofuels that are not food-based are likely to be of far greater importance over the long term. The last article that I read, Carbon Negative Biofuels from Low Input High Diversity Grassland Biomass, focuses on the main types of biomass that are used to create biofuels. The two major classes of biomass for biofuel production recognized to date are monoculture crops grown on fertile soils and waste biomass. Still, these two types fall victim to all the negative effects that we've learned about throughout this video. Then, they suggest a third, alternative option, one which was mentioned in an earlier article. This potential third option is high-diversity mixtures of plants grown with low inputs on agriculturally degraded lands, aka LIHD. This graph shows how much better LIHD are at greenhouse gas reduction. And Tillman and company say that LIHD could eliminate 15% of current global CO2 emissions. GIS Insights. To get a better grasp on the problem with biofuels, using GIS, I created a map displaying all the land in Minnesota that could be converted to cropland to produce corn for ethanol. From there, I calculated some interesting statistics about the findings to gain further insights. This was the data that I used throughout. It was provided by the UST Geography Department. This is the model I used to create my map that displays an optimistic estimate of corn production in Minnesota. I did this by creating a raster that combined developed areas, protected lands, forest, water, and areas with unsuitable slope as unsuitable areas, leaving the rest as suitable lands. In my optimistic Minnesota corn production map, the color yellow represents all the land that would be suitable for corn production based on my criteria. Using some stats from the internet, I was able to calculate some rough numbers from the map as well. The total amount of bushels that could be produced from this is about 3 billion. And then the total gallons of ethanol that could be produced from that is about 9 billion gallons. And the gasoline equivalent to that is about 6 billion gallons of gasoline. This means that 252% of Minnesota's gas consumption would be accounted for if this corn production was possible. That accounts for roughly 4% of America's gas use. Thoughts? I feel that some of the renewable energy we use in the future should come from biofuels. Still, the map estimating optimal corn production in Minnesota is completely overly optimistic and most likely not possible. Our renewable energy should be from more efficient and less harmful sources. Biofuels do not seem to be worth the effort and backing that go into them, and they aren't the answer to our problems.